Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second annual Easter Public Lecture. My name is Anthony Royal, Principal at King's Evangelical Divinity School. We're delighted to have you with us for what promises to be a thoughtful and engaging exploration of one of the central claims of the Christian faith. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Licona. Dr. Licona is a New Testament scholar, historian, and Christian apologist, serving as Associate Professor of Theology at Houston Christian University and as President of Risen Jesus Ministries. He is widely recognized for his work on the historical reliability of the Gospels, and in particular for his extensive research on the resurrection of Jesus. He is author of several important works, including The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach, and is known for engaging both scholarly and popular audiences with clarity, rigor, and intellectual integrity. This evening, he will be speaking on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. At the heart of Christianity lies a claim that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, a claim that has been debated, defended, and scrutinized for centuries. Dr. Licona is also known for his public debates with Dr. Bart Ehrman, and tonight he will help us consider what historical methods can tell us about this event and how we might assess the evidence with care and seriousness. The lecture will run for around an hour and will be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to engage further with the topic. We are recording the lecture, so please ensure microphones are off. And if you do not wish to appear on the recording, please turn off your camera. So for now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Licona.
Well, thank you. And Christ is risen, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. And Professor Royal, thank you for inviting me to come and address your group. I've been looking forward to it. Well, yesterday, we as Christians celebrated Easter and the resurrection of Jesus. So it's pretty cool stuff. But did Jesus actually rise from the dead? We believe he did, but must we believe that by faith? Is there decent historical evidence for this? Well, this is something that I was wondering about several years ago, well, several decades ago. And I started to doubt my Christian faith. I'd become a Christian at the age of 10 and went to a Christian university. I was really growing in my faith and reading the Bible for a couple hours a day, praying for 1 to 2 hours a day while I was in grad school, and just really loving growing in my relationship with the Lord. I was doing a master's degree in New Testament studies. I was focusing on learning Koine Greek so I could read the New Testament in its original language, and I was taking lots of courses. I took the equivalent of 10 graduate level courses in Greek, and was really enjoying reading scripture in its original language. But then one day, I don't know what caused it, but one day I just asked myself, is this stuff really true? How will I know it's true? Could it be? I feel like I've got a relationship with the Lord, but do people of other religious beliefs have the same kind of feeling? I know that Mormons who come to the door say that, they're confident Mormonism is true because they've read the Book of Mormon and the Holy Spirit has told them that the Book of Mormon is true. And how did that differ from the confidence that I had? And when I took the challenge of Mormonism to read the Book of Mormon and pray and ask with a sincere heart to know whether it's true, I did. I didn't read the whole Book of Mormon, but I read a big chunk of it and prayed, and I believe God told me it's not true. So, what do we do with that? It's a pretty subjective test. You come to Islam, it's another subjective test. On at least 2 occasions in the Quran, it says, if you want to know that the Quran is God's word, just try to create a surah, a chapter like one in the Quran. You can get all the wisest people and wisest spirits together and try to create one like it. You'll find that you can't. And that should convince you that the Quran is divinely inspired, it's from God. Well, and by the way, in one of those tests, it says, you can test it in that way to try to create a surah to see if it's true. But if you do it, you will be eternally damned. So it's like, well, it's not a great test. And anyway, I took it anyway. And because the Quran has 114 surahs, chapters, and they're not, if you ever read the Quran, it's not like a gospel. It's not a narrative. It's not a biography. It's more like Psalms. So each surah is independent. So you have an introductory surah, and then the other 113 of them go from the longest down to the shortest. So all you have to do is look at the last 10, 11, 12 of them, and you'll be able to, see, I mean, these are really, really short. And then think, can I create one like this? I submit to you that it's quite easy to do so. Now, maybe a Muslim will come back and say, yeah, but you're doing it in English. The Quran is originally written in Arabic, and the Quran flows. It's beautiful and poetic in its style. And what I hear from Muslim background believers, they were former Muslims, now they're Christians, they acknowledge that the way the Quran sounds when you read it in Arabic is just beautiful. So, maybe I could put some rhythm and rhyme to, put something together, create a small surah and make it rhyme. You say, yeah, but it's not Arabic. It's not as beautiful as Arabic. Well, what if I don't think Arabic is that beautiful? What if I prefer French or Spanish or German? Well, not German, but what if I prefer another language over Arabic? I mean, does it really come down choosing between what language I think is better? So I think the Quran just fails its own test. And that's why when Muslims are trying to prove the truth of Islam, they never even use the only test the Quran gives to know whether it's true. It's a very weak test. And so because of that, I think Islam is one of the most easily refuted religions in the world. Now, when you come to Hinduism, you've got the Vedas, which scholars think that they originated somewhere between 1500 and 1500 and 400 BC is when they originated. But they were communicated only by word of mouth. By word of mouth, all the way up until sometime between 500 and 300 BC. So as much as 1,000 years between when they originated and when they first got put in writing. So it's like, well, how do we know that we have today in the Vedas what was originally written? And we have no idea how they were formed or who wrote them down or came up with them initially. So it's like, wow, can I really believe this stuff? And then when it comes to Buddhism, everything about the Buddha, stories about him and his teachings, most Buddhist scholars think that he died in the 4th century BC. Everything about the Buddha and his teachings was communicated word of mouth exclusively until the 1st century, 400 years later. So, can I trust that? So when it comes to Christianity, what kind of evidence what's the test that Christianity gives? Well, several occasions we find that Jesus makes some really radical claims, and the skeptics of that day, his critics, say, show us a sign, give us some evidence. He says, I'll give you one evidence, my resurrection. So in John chapter 2, he says, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. John says, after his resurrection, they knew that he was referring to his body at that point. You got the sign of Jonah in Matthew. You've got Mark 8, Mark chapter 9, where Jesus is predicting his death and resurrection. So his resurrection is the sign that he's going to give to inform us or tell us, prove to us that he is who he claimed to be. Well, that doesn't help us that much. I mean, it could have helped the disciples because they would have seen him. Could have helped Paul because he would have seen him. But does it really help us today unless there's some evidence for it? So, I've looked at this for over a quarter of a century, and I think there's some really good historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I ended up Gary Habermas, who's the foremost authority on this subject, he mentored me, and we put together a book, and it was published in 2004, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And as we were finishing up in 2003, I said to him, I said, Doc, you've got a bibliography of about 2,400 academic sources written from 1975 up till the time we published a book on where scholars are. And so you know where they are, but who are these scholars? Now it's over 5,500 sources, but who are these scholars? And he said, well, most of them, almost all of them are New Testament scholars, and you got a few philosophers. I said, well, but this is a historical question. Do you have any general historians who are studying this and writing on it? He said, you could count them on a single hand, the number that are doing it, and nobody is doing it in a real exhaustive manner. And I thought, well, I would like to engage in that kind of thing. I want to learn how historians carry on their trade, and then I want to be able to do an investigation like that. And so that's what I did my doctoral dissertation on. Shortly into it, as I'm studying what professional historians and philosophers of history are saying, they're saying there's no such thing as an unbiased historian. Everybody is biased who is inquiring in history, and that one's biases definitely poses the most serious threat to the integrity of their investigation. And I realized that applied to me as well, because I wanted the resurrection to be proven. And so as I'm going through my research, I noticed that people who I agree with, they believe in the resurrection, people like N.T. Wright or Richard Bauckham or Habermas or Bill Craig, I'm reading their stuff real carefully, but then when it came to others like a Garrett Ludeman or John Dominic Cross and someone like that, I would just skim their writings because I already knew they were wrong, right? And I realized that, hey, this is a mistake, that this isn't carrying on my work with integrity. So I'd have to start over and reread those writings to make sure that I'm comprehending what the skeptic's saying and to give it serious consideration, not just to blow it off, but to give it serious consideration and be open-minded. So my doctoral work lasted 5.5 years, and which is a lot longer than normal. And my dissertation ended up being 3.5 to 4 times the average size of a dissertation. But I really wanted to get to the bottom line. This was really important to me. So I want to share with you kind of in a nutshell tonight what that investigation looked like. If you want to see it in detail, a slightly revised version of my doctoral dissertation was published. Professor Royal mentioned it, The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach. It's a little over 700 pages long. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to bring up my slides. And all right, Professor Royal, can you tell me, are we looking at the same thing here?
Yes, I can see your slides.
Okay, great. I'm just curious, am I in the slide at all?
You're off to the side. You're spotlighted for everyone, so they should be able to see you as well as the slides.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about practice of history, and we'll look at some preliminary issues here. So as Richard Evans at Cambridge has said, it's like practicing history is often like looking through a window into the past. And oftentimes the window is dirty and foggy and you can't see clearly what's going on. But there are occasions when it is very clear what we're seeing. So it's typical in history that things aren't going to be crystal clear and we're not going to get answers to all of our questions. The historian's objective is to arrive at an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. We can't get into a time machine, go to the past and verify our conclusions. So all we can look for is probability. We are We're not going to look for an exhaustive account. We can't expect that we're going to get everything 100% accurate. We are looking for an essentially faithful representation of what occurred and what probably occurred, as I said a moment ago. All right, so there are a number of things that, as I mentioned, they can compromise the integrity of our investigation. There are challenges. It's our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our religious, political, and religious convictions, the way we were raised, the group of people we desire to affiliate with, and whose acceptance we desire. There's no way around this. All of us are subject to this. These are what these are what historians refer to as our horizons. Dale Allison, who is a distinguished professor at Princeton, he says this. He's one of the leading New Testament scholars in the world. He also has a big book on the resurrection. He thinks Jesus rose from the dead, but he doesn't think it proves Christianity, because he thinks that Buddhists and Hindus have alternate interpretations of what happened to Jesus, but he does think Jesus rose, just that it doesn't confirm Christianity. That's where he's coming from. But here's what he says. Some we might think of as having no theological agenda are partially motivated by an animus against traditional Christian doctrine, which is, in reality, just another sort of theological agenda. The trite truth is that none of us is without philosophical bias or theological interest when we sit down to study Christian origins. Chris Lorenz is professor of the philosophy of history and historiography at VU University in Amsterdam. Here's what he writes. Again, this isn't one writing from a Christian perspective. I don't even know where he is on his worldviews. He is a philosopher of history and a historian. And here's what he writes. A proper philosophy of history must elucidate the fact that historians present reconstructions of a past reality on the basis of factual research and discuss the adequacy of these reconstructions. At the same time, it must elucidate the fact that these discussions seldom lead to a consensus, and that therefore pluralism is a basic characteristic of history as a discipline. This was a real eye-opener for me. He's not the only one that's a philosopher of history and general historian who says these things. In other words, he is saying that it's very often the case that pluralism, the state in which there are multiple views out there and no consensus, that this is the state within a lot of historical inquiry. There's not a consensus in a lot of what's going on in historical investigations today. That's just a basic characteristic of history as a discipline. So, summarizing these preliminary issues, we've seen that all historians have biases, and a consensus of historians is often absent. So we realize that as Christians, as well as atheists and everybody else, we're all going to have biases. We have to be careful about that. And we shouldn't expect a consensus conclusion on whether Jesus rose from the dead. That's not going to happen. It doesn't happen on a lot of non-religious issues. So, of course, when a person's worldview is often going to interfere and act as umpire in a historical investigation, and have more pull than the data itself, well, we're not going to expect a consensus in answer to the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? It's just not plausible. So with those things in mind, let's build a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. And we're just going to use two major building blocks, facts and method. Pretty simple, facts and method. Let's start with the facts. Now, here, I remember Paula Fredrickson. She's a Jewish historian at Boston College. And what she says is she refers to things called historical bedrock, which she says is facts past doubting. In other words, these are, let's face it, some things are more strongly evidenced than others. So, for example, Jesus' death by crucifixion has a lot more evidence in its favor than his virgin birth. That's not to say we shouldn't believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. Doesn't mean that there's no evidence that Jesus was born a virgin. It's just to say there's a lot stronger and a lot more evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion than there is for his virgin birth or a number of other things. So historical bedrock is to refer to facts that are so strongly evidenced that they are virtually just beyond doubt. And so you want to build a hypothesis on the bedrock. And if a hypothesis can't account for any of the bedrock, then that hypothesis is almost certainly mistaken. And then, of course, there's other things. Like I said, you've got the virgin birth, and that's going to be toward the top. So you got bedrock there, and as you get up a little bit further, it's going to be a little, it's not going to be quite as strong, but it's still going to be pretty strong, and the evidence gets not as strong as you go to the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build the case virtually on almost all historical bedrock, and I'll show you how we do that. So when it comes to our earliest Christian literature, and we think about the resurrection, the first thing that usually comes to mind are the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these, we don't know exactly when they were written, but for the most part, most scholars believe Mark was written between the years 65 and 70, that Matthew and Luke were written between 70 and 85, and the Gospel of John between 90 and 95. I'm not saying this is when they were written. I'm not saying it's not. It really doesn't matter for what we're discussing here. But this is where the majority of scholars fall today on this. Now, there was Morris Casey and his student. His name eludes my memory at the moment. But two agnostic scholars over there in the UK. Casey died a few years back, an agnostic bordering on atheism. James Crossley is the other one. It was a student, and he's a professor in his own rights now. They put Mark in the 40s. There are many scholars, probably 10% of those who comment on it, that put Mark after 70. Then you have John, some place John in the 2nd century, but very few. You have some who place John somewhere between 65 and 70. Some place him 80 to 85, but the majority place him 90 to 95. I'm going to be primarily concerned with writings and traditions that predate all of the Gospels. Okay, so one we have here is Paul. Now, the neat thing about Paul is he was not a believer before he said he saw the risen Jesus. In fact, he was out persecuting churches, and then one day he had an experience he says he believed was the risen Jesus who appeared to him. And that experience radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, there are 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. And of these, scholars are unanimous that he wrote at least 7. And of the other 6, they're evenly divided on 2 of them. And then on 4 of them, the majority of critical scholars don't think Paul wrote them. Now, I'm not here tonight to talk about whether Paul wrote those disputed letters. What I am going to say is, for the undisputed letters, those 7, those are the only letters on which I'm going to draw this evening. So the whole thing about this is this case for the resurrection is not going to be based on the Gospels. So if someone were to say, well, I don't believe the resurrection because I think the Gospels were filled with errors. Sorry about the dog here. The Gospels were filled with errors and contradictions. We don't know who the authors were. The authors were biased. They were written too long after the events they purported to describe. They weren't written by eyewitnesses. None of those objections make any difference because I'm not building my case on the Gospels. I'm building it on sources that predate the Gospels. Moreover, you can't respond and say, well, I don't think Paul didn't write that letter, because I'm only going to appeal to the letters that Paul wrote. So trying to make as airtight a case as possible. Now, one of those letters Paul wrote is the church was to the church in Galatia, in Galatians. And in Galatians chapter 1, Paul says that 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and he met with Peter. He visited Peter for 15 days. Peter, of course, was Jesus' lead apostle. And then he said, I also saw James, the brother of the Lord. So that's pretty remarkable. And in fact, you've got even Bart Ehrman, who's, at least over here in the US, he's probably the most influential skeptical New Testament here in the US and maybe even in the world. And here's what Ehrman says. He says, Paul was personally acquainted with Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, and Jesus' own brother, James. These are two good people to know. If you want to know anything about the historical Jesus, I wish I knew them. So that's quite an admission from such a skeptical scholar. So what do you think Paul and Peter talked about during those time together? Well, we don't know because he doesn't say, but it almost certainly involved, what it was like for Peter and James. Well, James hadn't been with Jesus during his ministry, but what was it like growing up with Jesus? Why did you were a skeptic before the resurrection? What convinced you? And then for Peter, what was it like walking with Jesus all those years? Peter, I heard he raised the dead. Is that true? I heard he walked on water. Did that really happen? You imagine the kind. Peter, why don't you tell me what it was like when he appeared to you after his resurrection? I'll share with you what it was like when he appeared to me. I mean, of course they're talking about Jesus. Well, then Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, that 14 years later, he went back up to Jerusalem, and this time he did so in order to run the gospel message past them, to see if he was preaching the same gospel they were preaching. And he said, they added nothing to what I was saying. They gave me the right hand of fellowship. You're good, Paul. Keep up the good work, brother. Now, that doesn't mean that everything Paul taught is what they taught. It didn't mean that there weren't any disagreements at some point. We know from the book of Acts and from Galatians 1 that there were some disagreements on non-gospel essentials. But when it came to the gospel, we can see that gospel message that Paul is preaching the same thing as the Jerusalem apostles. Now, would it be great if a lost letter of Paul was discovered, and that letter said, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you? I mean, that'd be really cool, because then we would know exactly what Jesus' disciples, as well as Paul, were preaching in terms of the gospel message. I mean, we know Paul had some letters that have been lost. 1 Corinthians talks about a previous letter that Paul had written to them. You've got end of Colossians. He talks about the letter that he wrote to the church at Laodicea. What? What about that letter? We don't have that. So it's like, yeah, there's probably a few letters that Paul wrote that we no longer have. So what if one of those were discovered and it gave us the gospel message? Well, folks, we don't need to wait for the discovery of a lost letter, because we have it in one of Paul's undisputed letters, 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says, I want to remind you, brethren, of the gospel message I preached to you. And then he proceeds in verses 3 through 7 to give us some oral tradition that had been passed along to him by the apostles. And here's what he says. He says, I delivered to you what I also received. Now, those two terms, delivered and received, were often used for the imparting of oral tradition. So Paul is saying, I delivered to you what I also received. When did he deliver it to them? Almost certainly in the year 51 when he established the church in Corinth. And then when did he receive it? Well, he doesn't say, but it would have been before then. So by the year 50, he would have received it. And so at some point between the years, well, if Jesus died in 30 or 33, between when he died and the year 50, so 17 to 20 years within that period of time, within 20 years, 1 to 20 years, this oral tradition he's going to give us was formulated. Now, you've got some skeptical scholars like Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar, Gerrit Ludemann, who is an atheist. They say that we can be confident that it was within 2 to 3 years. James D.G. Dunn said we can be entirely confident that this tradition was formed within 6 months of the crucifixion. Well, none of them give any evidence for this. And as much as I'd like to say within 6 months or within 2 to 3 years, and they may be correct, they probably are that it was formulated within that period of time, but we don't know. At the very latest, though, we can say within 20 years. And that's still really, really early. And here's what this early tradition said. I delivered to you what I also received. So this is the oral tradition he received from the apostles, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. And then he lists a number of the appearances. So you have death, burial, resurrection, and appearances. And he lists the appearances to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time. And Paul adds, most of these people are still alive, although some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And then Paul says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now notice what we have here. We got 3 individual appearances, and look who it's to Peter and James. Now remember, he met with them twice, 3 years after his conversion and 14 years later. So of course he's getting this information from them firsthand. And then Paul, he's speaking as an eyewitness of Jesus' appearance to him. And then you got the appearance to the 12, to more than 500, and to all of the apostles. These are group appearances. So you have 3 individual appearances and 3 group appearances. And then Paul says in verse 11, whether I or they, that is the other apostles, this is what we preached, and this is what you believed. So it's not, so we can see it's quite obvious here from Paul's letters, and that he had his gospel message confirmed by the Jerusalem apostles, that they are preaching the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, and appearances to individuals and groups, to friend and foe alike. But we can go further than just saying they were claiming he rose and appeared to them. We can show that they actually believed it. Now, there's a lot of reports that the disciples endured persecution and even martyrdom for their preaching. Some of these are really embellished or amplified, and some of them may have just been invented. We just don't know. Historians like early sources, we do have 5 early sources from the 1st century talk about the persecution and even the martyrdom of the persecution of all the disciples and the martyrdom of some. So first we have Paul's undisputed letters, and he talks about the great persecution that he and the other apostles endured. Imprisonment, beatings, all kinds of persecution. You have Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that they die daily. In other words, they face the possibility of death, of being killed on a daily basis for their proclamation of the gospel. The book of Acts talks about the persecution of all of the apostles, and even the execution, the martyrdom of James, the son of Zebedee. I think that's in Acts chapter 12. Of course, you get the martyrdom of Stephen, but I'm talking about of the disciples of Jesus here. So you got James, the son of Zebedee, who is martyred in Acts chapter 12, and throughout that the book of Acts, we find so many of the apostles who are persecuted. The Gospel of John talks about the martyrdom of Peter. Say, well, where is that? Well, that's in John 21. Jesus and Peter, after Jesus' resurrection, Jesus and Peter are walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus tells Peter, Peter, you can go wherever you want right now. You can do whatever you want to do. But the day is coming when that's not going to be the case. You're not going to have that freedom. People are going to take you where you don't want to go, and you will stretch out your hands. And John adds, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. So, if John is written, if it's written between 90 and 95, as most scholars believe, it's referring to the martyrdom of Peter, which is thought to have taken place somewhere about 25 to 30 years earlier, 20 to 25 years earlier in 64 or 65. And even those who date John early before the destruction of the temple, a few do, and that would be the years, right before the destruction of the temple. Still, that would be after Peter would have been executed. So John is actually reporting the martyrdom of Peter. And then you have Josephus, who mentions the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus. So you got the Gospel of John that mentions the martyrdom of Peter, and Josephus, who mentions the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus, the two apostles, of which two of the three apostles that Paul had met with. That's pretty interesting. And then you have Clement of Rome. In First Clement, he mentions the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. So you say, but this doesn't really prove that the resurrection happened and Jesus really appeared to them. Hey, I agree. But it strongly suggests that they believed that Jesus rose and had appeared to them, right? So it's like Muslim terrorists who blow themselves up in the name of jihad. They do so because they believe Islam is true. It doesn't prove that Islam is true, of course, but they believe that it's true. And in a similar way, the disciples, the fact that they were willing to suffer persecution, willing to die, even as martyrs for their belief, strongly suggests that they sincerely believed Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. Liars make poor martyrs. So the disciples were not only claiming Jesus rose and appeared to them, they actually believed it, which means they weren't lying. It also means it wasn't a legend that developed over time, doesn't it? So what do they mean by resurrection? It's been popular in the past to say, well, resurrection in a spiritual sense. Jesus appeared to them as a spirit or in a vision. Well, what do they mean by resurrection? Well, in 1 Corinthians 15:20, Paul says, now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. In other words, the first to be raised from the dead with a resurrection body. But when are the rest of us going to be raised? My mom died in 2013. My dad died the following year. They were both followers of Jesus. When, according to Paul, are they going to be raised from the dead? Well, Paul answers that 3 verses later. Now, each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then those who belong to Christ at his coming. So Christ was raised in the year 30 or 33, and then those who belong to Christ will be raised when Jesus returns. Now, of course, in the meantime, we know from Paul, he says, for to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. And he says, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So basically what we're looking at here is when we die, our spirit leaves and goes to be with Christ in heaven. And then when he returns, he brings our spirits back with him, puts them back in our corpses, and brings them back to life, and then transforms them into a resurrection body. So it's a physical resurrection. Here's another verse, Romans 8:11. Paul says, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. He raised Jesus' mortal body. He will also give life to our mortal bodies. When is this going to happen? A few verses later, verse 23, he talks about when Christ returns, we will experience the redemption of our bodies. So again, it is a physical, bodily resurrection that the disciples had in mind. And remember, we're getting this all from Paul's undisputed letters. We're not getting it from the Gospels or any of his disputed letters. So they meant physical bodily resurrection. But they also meant, we know that they also meant for Jesus's resurrection to be understood as a historical event. It really happened. How do we know this? I mean, you have some that of the liberals from back in the 60s and the 70s and even some of the 80s, and people like John Dominic Crossan even today will say, well, by resurrection, they don't mean physical resurrection. Even though they used it in physical terms, they didn't mean it that way. Crossan says that would have been theological yuck. No, they're just meaning that his teachings still live among us. You can almost sense his presence, even though he's not alive in any sense. Crossan doesn't believe that God exists, or a creator of the universe, I should say. Doesn't believe there's a personal being. And he thinks when we die, that's just it. We just cease to exist. So a metaphor in the sense that Jesus' teachings still live on today. But is this what the apostles meant? Well, we go back to 1 Corinthians 15 again. And here's what Paul says. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ was not raised. And if Christ was not raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. Then also those who have died in Christ have perished. So the argument that Paul is making here in 1 Corinthians 15, there are some that are saying there's no resurrection of the dead. You guys are wasting your time. And this life is all there is. So get as much out of life as you can. It's like John Lennon. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. It's a John Lennon kind of thing that they're telling the Christians in Corinth. And Paul's saying, look, Christ was raised. He's the first fruits. The rest of us are going to be raised at his coming. That's all part of the general resurrection. Jesus began the general resurrection. We will, when the second part 2 of the general resurrection occurs, we will be raised. So these two are inextricably linked. So if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, this life is all there is, and the Christian life is not worth living because it involves persecution. But, Paul goes on, Christ was raised. Therefore, we will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living. And of course, that argument makes no sense if he meant it as a metaphor. If it was just a metaphor, Paul would not have said, if I fought wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. So yes, they meant Jesus was raised in a historical sense. So let's wrap up the facts here. We got 6. Number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, a number of his disciples had experiences they interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them. They claimed the risen Jesus appeared to groups. Paul had an experience he interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. The apostles believed Jesus was raised bodily, physically from the dead. And the apostles believe the resurrection of Jesus is historical. These are historical bedrock, facts past doubting. Now the question is, what do we do with these facts? And that brings us to the second major building block. Oh, sorry. Just from these facts, here's what we can rule out. It wasn't a legend that developed over time, because we can trace this back to the original disciples of Jesus. It probably wasn't a lie, because all of them were willing to be persecuted and willing to go to their deaths. We don't know that all of them did die as martyrs. They may have. However, they were certainly all willing to die as martyrs. When you've got several of them, like Peter and James, the son of Zebedee, and James, the brother of Jesus, who are dying for their gospel proclamation, and they continue to proclaim the gospel, that means that they're willing to face the same kind of fate. So they probably weren't lying. They understood resurrection as bodily, physical. It wasn't just spiritual, and it wasn't a metaphor. So that brings us to our second block, building block method. This one goes a lot quicker. There are usually several criteria that I talk about that historians use: explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc, things like that. I don't have time to get into all of them, but in using arguments of inference to the best explanation, we'll go with one of the more important ones and the easier ones, and that's explanatory scope. I want you to think of a puzzle, and you've got all these pieces and you're trying to put together the entire puzzle. Well, sometimes you can't figure where a piece of the puzzle goes. So let's say you got a puzzle and it's got 10 orphaned pieces, and then you got another puzzle that's got no orphaned pieces. Well, the one with no orphaned pieces has greater explanatory scope than the one with 10 orphaned pieces. And it's the same way with historical hypotheses. The hypothesis that can explain all of the facts, well, that can account for them all, has greater explanatory scope than one that can account for just some or most of them. And the one, of course, that can account for the max number of facts is the one that is to be preferred. Explanatory power is you want to make sure that the facts fit. You don't want to force them to fit. We've all tried to do that in order at some point or another to finish the puzzle and to see if we can make a piece fit. Well, some will try to make facts fit into the puzzle. So, for example, Gerrit Ludemann, I mentioned him as an atheist New Testament scholar. He said, well, in answer, Paul, we wouldn't expect him to hallucinate. A lot of people would say you don't expect him to hallucinate because he hated Jesus. He wasn't grieving. But, Paul probably had a friend, a Gentile friend growing up. And when he learned the gospel, he wanted his friend saved. And so that's where he got his call to preach to the Gentiles. Jesus really didn't appear to him. It was just a hallucination. Well, that's really lacking explanatory power. You are trying to force something to fit. So let's look at two hypotheses here. And then I'm going to open it up for some questions, and we can consider some others if you want. So the resurrection hypothesis, the hypothesis that Jesus was raised bodily, physically from the dead, does it account for his death? Well, of course. You can't have resurrection without death. And there's really good evidence for Jesus's death. What about the appearances? Does it account for those? Yep, sure does. Does it account for the appearance to groups? Yep. Does it account for the appearance to the persecutor of the church, Paul? Yep. Does it account for why they believe Jesus was raised physically? Absolutely. Does it account for why they thought Jesus' resurrection was a historical event? Yes. So in other words, if Jesus really rose from the dead, it accounts for all of these 6 facts that we looked at. But there are a number of other alternate hypotheses, and we don't have time to go through them all. So let me just turn to the most popular one given by scholars today when they actually take an alternative hypothesis. Hallucinations. Now, on the surface, this would seem quite plausible, right? I mean, after all, you look and you say, well, um, they were grieving. And when a loved one dies, it's common for them to grieve. And through that, we know through multiple um, studies that have been done for over a century that about 50% of those grieving the loss of a loved one experience a hallucination of that loved one. Now, the majority of those experiences, they don't see them or hear them, they just have a sense of presence. In other words, a full 39% have a sense of presence. But only 14% of those grieving the loss of a loved one have a visual hallucination of that loved one. So what a hallucination is too, let's talk about that. It's a false sensory perception. It has no external reality to it. It's something that goes on in the mind of an individual. So in that sense, hallucinations are like dreams. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Hawaii. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. Or let's say I've got a room, let's say all of us decided to do an experiment, and we're all going to take a sleeping pill, and we're going to go to sleep, and I want all of us to dream that we're in Hawaii. Okay? And let's see, when we wake up, how many of us, what percentage of us do you think we're going to dream we're in Hawaii? Do you think 100%? Not a chance. And those of us who dream we're in Hawaii, what do you think are the probabilities that those dreams would be so similar that we all thought we experienced the same dream, that we actually interacted with one another in our dream? It's not going to happen. Well, it's the same way with hallucinations, because hallucinations, again, are in the mind of an individual. You can't experience the same hallucination, and you're not going to experience the same things simultaneously. So with that in mind, does the hallucination hypothesis account for the death of Jesus? Yes, because that would have been the thing that would have placed them in the frame of mind to hallucinate. They would have been grieving at that point. So yes, it does account for the death of Jesus. Does it account for the appearances? No. And the reason being is, remember, only 14% of those grieving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination. We saw in the very earliest tradition, he appeared to the 12. He appeared to more than 500 at one time. He appeared to all of the apostles. The 12 and all of the apostles, that's 100%, not 14%. Does it account for the group appearances? No, for the reason that I just gave. They're like dreams, hallucinations are. They're in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality. So you can't have a group hallucination. You can have, you say, well, what happened with the Marian apparitions? Well, how do we know that those were hallucinations? You know, there's the one in Zaytun, Egypt in the 1960s, I think 1968. It looks like something happened there. It's inexplicable. Whether you think it's Mary or not, I guess is going to depend on your theology, but you can't just say that was a hallucination. They've even got the figure on, they took photographs. Thousands of people saw the same figure at once. It moved about, they could see it. So there still really is no good evidence that there are group hallucinations. And what we know from psychology, they seem impossible. Does the hallucination hypothesis account for the appearance to Paul? Well, Ludemann, again, he thought it did, but you know, it was really a stretch to say that, and it's wild speculation without any direct factual support. The fact of the matter is that Paul was not grieving Jesus' death. He was glad Jesus was dead. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. So it doesn't account for Paul. Does it account for why they believe Jesus was physically, bodily raised? I don't think so. Most hallucinations are would be more inclined to have them think that Jesus was raised spiritually, not physically. Does it account for why they believe Jesus was raised historically? Yeah, I suppose it would. Would it do so to an extent that they'd be willing to suffer and die for it? I don't know. I think the jury'd be out for that. I think this is one of the more weakly attested ones, but I want to be generous here. So I'd say, yeah, I think hallucination could lead them to believe that Jesus was still alive. So you can see the difference between the resurrection hypothesis, which is all green lights, compared to the hallucination hypothesis, the leading alternate hypothesis when one is offered by skeptics. The resurrection hypothesis beats it hands down. And so we can see Jesus' resurrection is by far the best explanation of the widely agreed upon facts. And that's pretty cool because it strongly suggests that Jesus did actually rise. Sorry about that. That Jesus actually did rise from the dead. That gives us the hope of eternal life. It tells us that we don't have a blind faith. We actually have Jesus telling critics of him that he would provide an evidence to know that he was the uniquely divine Son of God who offers salvation. And he gives a real, not a subjective test to say, just read this book and pray and God will show you it's true, or try to create a chapter like one in this book and you'll know that you can't. A subjective tests like those. No, this is a real test. If you kill me, I'll rise from the dead 3 days later. And we've got some serious historical evidence to suggest that he actually did rise from the dead, that it is the best historical explanation of the widely agreed upon, virtually indisputable data that we looked at. So that's pretty cool. So how about if I open it up at this point for some questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Licona, for that stimulating presentation. Please join me in thanking Dr. Licona in his presentation. We're going to take half an hour for some questions. For those who have joined us for the first time, please do use the raise your hand emoji if you'd like to ask a question. Alternatively, there is a chat. You can post your question in the chat if you don't wish to appear on the recording. So we've got a few questions coming in already. So Iman, would you like to ask the first question?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Anthony. Hi, Dr. Michael. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and it's very interesting. And I have maybe two questions here. Like, what do you think the difference between Jesus' body before and after his resurrection? Like in the gospel, Jesus often disappeared after his resurrection. So is this a sign of the difference in his body's condition before and after the resurrection? And maybe the second question, still related to this question, like, and do our resurrected bodies, when Jesus returns, have the same condition as our current bodies, like our current bodies, like, or is there any like the perfection of our resurrected
how about if I
bodies?
mention about Christ's body? Well, yes, there's continuity between Christ's body that he died, in which he lived here on earth, and what he has. It's the resurrection and transformation of that body. Paul talks about our bodies being changed. He says in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, verses 42 through 44, our body is sown a corruptible body, it is raised incorruptible. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It's sown in dishonor, it's buried, that is, it's raised in glory. It is sown or buried a natural body, it has raised a spiritual body. Now, the two words that he uses there for natural and physical, I did a word search on this for my doctoral research. Sukakos is the Greek word for natural there. You have a few English translations like the New Revised Standard Version and a few others that translate that physical. But there were like close to about 950 uses of that term from the 8th century BC through the year 200. And so, or maybe it was 300, it was 1100 years. And in not a single one of those cases did the word mean physical. So it's widely agreed among many scholars today that the translation, it has sown a physical body, it's raised a spiritual body, is not a good translation. It's no longer sustainable. It means mortal and it means weak, like, you know, in its, well, corruptible and so forth. That's how Paul is describing these, our body. But sukakos means basically mortal with all of its weaknesses in it. Spiritual can mean immaterial, but it can also mean some other things. Like, for example, earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, Paul says the natural man, sukakos, same word as he's using in 1 Corinthians 15:44, the natural man cannot understand the things of the Spirit, for they are spiritually, pneumatikos, the same word that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15. They are spiritually assessed. So, of course, there he's not talking about a difference between physical and spiritual. So I think what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 15 is our body is buried as one a natural body, in other words, one that is corruptible, that is animated by natural organs, our heart, lungs, kidneys, things like that. But the body that is raised will be spiritually animated. The Holy Spirit will animate it. We don't need hearts, lungs, liver, kidney, things like that when in our resurrection body. It is a transformation. It's like Paul says in Philippians 3:21 that Christ will transform our humble body to be conformed to his glorious one. So that answers your second question when he says, again, he will transform our humble body to be conformed to his glorious one. And remember Romans 8:11. The Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal body. So, yeah, our mortal body is going to be transformed into a resurrection body, just like Jesus had when he was raised from the dead. So when Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, and the widow's son were raised, they were raised in the same kind of body, mortal body, in which they died, only to get sick and die again. But when we are raised from the dead, we will be raised in the same mortal body, which will then be transformed into an immortal body that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15:42 through 44. I hope that makes sense.
That's great. That's great. Christian, you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Dr. Licona, for your intriguing presentation. I quite enjoyed it. I dropped 2 questions in the chat, and I also developed a third since then. I'll try to be brief. So for the first question, you mentioned that Paul probably gathered much of his gospel from Peter and James, but it brought to my mind Galatians 1:11 through 12, where Paul says that he received his gospel from revelation of Jesus Christ, not from any man. So I was wondering how do we interpret that verse in light of his interactions with Peter and James? And then my second question would be,
hang on a second. That one's real easy. So Paul did get the gospel message. He received it from Jesus, of course, But when he says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, I delivered to you what I also received, he's talking about the format of the early oral tradition that he passed on to them. Does that make sense?
So he's differentiating oral tradition from his gospel.
Well, the gospel message is in the oral tradition, but it's the format of it in this creed. So if you remember that, well, you wouldn't remember this, but the slide that I showed the way I had it, I should have mentioned at the time, there's parallelism that's going on that's there to assist in memory. So you have long, short, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. So Paul says, number one, I delivered to you what I also received. This is oral tradition. Then you have parallelism, which shows that it has been formed into like a creed for memorization. And then in verses 11, 12, and 14, Paul uses the term kerugma, or kerygma, we'd say in English, to suggest that this is formalized for public preaching. This is the formal public proclamation that was given here. So everything Paul's saying there in the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15 suggests that this is oral tradition that had been passed along to him. So he's passing along this early creed as the apostles were preaching. The death, burial, resurrection, and the appearances, and then the ones he lists there.
Okay.
So it is the gospel message, but it's the format in which it is given that Paul is referring to. So let me give one other example. Maybe it will clarify it even more. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul gives the same formula here. I delivered to you what I also received from the Lord, he says. And then he gives the Eucharist sayings of Jesus, the sayings that Jesus gave at the Last Supper. And when you compare that with Luke's gospel and what he reports, it's verbatim. So this is early creedal material that was passed along to Paul.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. Thank you. Okay. And then my second question deals with 1 Corinthians 15:6. You mentioned the 500 plus witnesses who saw Jesus at one time. Do we have any historical evidence as to some of the identities of some of those witnesses? Like, could they have been some of the co-workers like Apollos or Barnabas or Timothy or Priscilla, Phoebe, Junia? Do we have any way of knowing?
No, there's nothing that is said of it of which I'm aware in antiquity that tries to identify any of those more than 500 at one time. The thing that's interesting, though, about it is that it's in the earliest report. So if this came in the Gospels later on, you'd probably have critics saying, well, this is just something, you can see how the evolution, this is just made up. But it's in the earliest, very earliest source that we have, and one that can be traced virtually back to the apostles themselves. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Then my last question is, we tend to look at the fact that there are more authentic ancient manuscripts of the New Testament than almost any other ancient document. Like, the closest is the Iliad, and that's still short by thousands of manuscripts. But something else I was thinking of is the fact that they managed to preserve this while being hunted and persecuted by the Roman Empire. Doesn't that speak to the authenticity of their faith, that this was factual and not made up? Not only the fact that they were willing to be martyred, but the fact that they were willing to go to such miraculous lengths to multiply and preserve all these manuscripts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it does show. I mean, what we're concerned about mainly are the apostles, right? Did they believe it? Because if we're going to say, well, the early Christians, well, yeah, of course, we know that those who came after the apostles and then even later into the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, the time of Eusebius, we know that they were willing to be persecuted. But that just shows that they believed it. Doesn't mean that they're not claiming to have seen the risen Jesus. They are believing based on the apostles, what the apostles had claimed, and that were written in the New Testament literature. But that just shows that these early Christians sincerely believed it doesn't show that Christianity is true or that Jesus rose. It's the apostles' willingness to suffer and willingness to die that shows they strongly suggest they weren't making this stuff up. They actually believed Jesus rose from the dead. And that distinguishes them from the later Christians and even for us. I mean, let's face it. We might, I mean, hopefully if we get persecuted, we would be willing to endure persecution and martyrdom for our belief in the gospel. But that does, for all we know, it's possible it could be wrong. But for the apostles, they knew that what they were proclaiming was either true or it was false. So there's a big difference between that. We might die for what we believe is true, but may not be, just like Muslims jihadis, they die for what they believe is true, but what is actually false. The apostles died for what they either knew was true or knew was false. And there's a big difference between the two. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your questions, Christian. That was excellent. I'm just going to build on a little bit from what Christian just asked in that last question, Dr. Licona, in that your presentation didn't really go too much into sort of comparative works of history or comparative historical events. I wonder if you could just take some time to maybe compare sort of the evidence that you've compiled regarding the resurrection of Jesus with other historical events and whether the resurrection of Jesus sort of stacks up in comparison to those events.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can find a document really quick. I may not be able to. A couple of years ago, yeah, that's not it. Let's see. A few years ago, I heard someone say about, let me just see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, I don't think I wish I knew where it was. I could pull it up quickly. I don't remember the name of the file either, so if that makes it. Let me just look up one more word. See if. Oh, this might be it. Nope, that's not it. All right, so I had heard it said a few years ago, and maybe you've even heard it as well, where they say, hey, the evidence we have for the resurrection is just as good as we have for the assassination of Julius Caesar. And I thought, that's just crazy. Yeah, that's just crazy to say that it's about the same. There's just no way. And I just thought this was an exaggerated claim by an apologist. And certainly I would guess it probably, they didn't realize they had never done a comparison of it. So I did, and I looked at all the evidence for the assassination of Julius Caesar. When it comes for the documentary evidence, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is actually a little better than what we have for the assassination of Caesar in terms of how early it is and how many early sources we have. But I'd say the explanatory power is a little better for the assassination of Caesar than it is for the resurrection. In other words, you got to explain how it is. If Caesar was not assassinated, then you've got to explain about how the final transition from of the Roman Republic to empire during the time of Augustus. How did Augustus come into power? Why were there so many reports of his assassination, etc.? So I think on balance, it's about the same, which really, to be honest with you, shocked me. And I had a document with it. I just wish I could pull it up real quickly, but I don't know where it is.
That's fine. That's fine. So, out of the criteria that you've mentioned in your presentation this evening, which particular criteria would you say is the strongest? For me, listening to your presentation, I would say perhaps the sort of the pluralistic approach, in that there are non-Christians or people who do not believe that Jesus was Messiah or God, that they too believe that it could be a historical event. People like Dale Allison, and there was also a Jewish theologian, fairly modern Jewish theologian. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, or whether I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Pinchas Lapid. I don't know if you've read some of his work on the resurrection.
Yes, I did read his book.
Yeah.
So are you saying what are some of the more powerful, what are the more powerful alternative hypotheses? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of, so for example, there are many people here tonight that perhaps would engage in conversations with others on this matter, whether it be an intellectual debate or whether it be just talking to a friend who isn't a Christian and wanted to sort of take some of the more convincing or powerful points of criterion and use that within a conversation. Would you say then? For me, it would appear from your presentation, you may disagree with this, that sort of the pluralistic approach to the evidence is perhaps maybe some of the more convincing or compelling arguments to the historical evidence of Jesus's resurrection.
But could you just unpack for me, just clarify real quickly what you mean by the pluralistic evidence?
So in that, there are non-Christians or people from different faiths or worldviews or beliefs that, although they're not Christians, would also say that, yes, it's a historical fact that Jesus did rise from the dead, but it doesn't mean that he is Messiah or that he is God.
Yeah, so you're right about Pinchas Lapid, a Jewish New Testament scholar. He wrote in his book on the resurrection. It's pretty interesting. I think it was back in the 80s too. So about 45 years ago. And he said something along the lines of, he talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and of course the difference. The Pharisees believed that there would be a resurrection. The Sadducees did not believe that there would be any life after death. And he said, when it came to Jesus, I used to be a Sadducee, but now I'm a Pharisee. So he believed that after his study of the historical data, he came to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. But he said he didn't think that Jesus was the Messiah. I don't remember if he gave reasons. I suppose it might be.
He said that because other people had rose from the dead. You know, he mentioned a few people in the Old Testament, and obviously the story of Lazarus as well. He said that alone doesn't prove that he is Messiah.
Gotcha. Okay. So he didn't believe, that makes sense. So he didn't believe Jesus was Messiah, but he said that Jesus is the, so they're still waiting. Jews still wait for a Messiah, but said Jesus is the Savior for Gentiles. So I think that's interesting. It's interesting that he would accept all the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, but then not really take into serious consideration also all of the evidence that Jesus claimed to be Messiah, which is certainly there. And then using the resurrection to prove that he was Messiah, the sign that he is Messiah. Dale Allison, Dale's a good friend. He's become a good friend over the last probably 7-8 years, maybe 9 years. Yeah, 9 years. He thinks Jesus rose from the dead, leaving behind an empty tomb, but he says that he doesn't think that it proves Christianity is true because Buddhists have their, they could interpret it as a rainbow body, which there's a phenomenon within Buddhism. It's very rare, but it happens on occasion, where a Buddhist shaman, a monk, will die, and then about a week or two later they go to where his body is, and it's shrunk down to, say, the size of an infant, a baby. And it's just inexplicable how that happens. The reason they call it rainbow body is because there was one occasion or so in the past when a rainbow was seen when they saw the body like this. But of course, this is over in Southeast Asia largely, and you're going to have a lot of rain over there, and you're going to have a lot of rainbows. So, but that's how it got the name rainbow body. There's one case where they go back later on and there's no corpse. All there is hair, fingernails, and toenails. That's the only thing that was there. And they don't know how to describe that. So they think, well, maybe Jesus is what, he had a rainbow body, no rainbow, but he had a rainbow body and everything just vanished. So he said, I don't know of any Buddhists who are claiming that this is of Jesus, but he says maybe you could give it a Buddhist interpretation like that. Or Hindus, they might say there's a reincarnation. Jesus was reincarnated. And he said there's no real reason to prefer resurrection over either of those, which I take exception to that. I think there is good reason. You've got Jesus actually claiming that after he is killed, he's predicting his imminent death and subsequent resurrection. And then these things happen. Like in the case of the rainbow bodies, rarely do you have one of these monks even predicting such a thing that's going to happen. But Jesus, we actually have good historical evidence. I've made a case for this in the big book on the resurrection, that Jesus actually predicted his imminent death and resurrection. And so, of course, and we got good reason to think that he did rise from the dead. So who are the people in the best place to be able to interpret what happened? Jesus' apostles who were there with him and who actually saw him, or Buddhists and Hindus who are retrofitting their own philosophical system that's entirely foreign to the Christian system, and that, frankly, is not based on nearly as good evidence as what we have for the Christian faith and the gospel. So I just think that is a very weak reason to reject historical kind of conclusion that Jesus was resurrected. Now, I'd be the first to admit that as historians, we have to be able to separate historical conclusions from theological implications. There are certain things that are beyond the tools of the historian. So, for example, the claim Jesus' death atones for sin. Well, the historian can certainly examine the data that would support the death of Jesus, but the historian has no tools for assessing the theological component of that claim to say that his death atones for sin. I mean, how could we ever do that as historians? Or, that Jesus is currently seated at the right hand of God. I mean, what tool would a historian have for that? Mm-hmm. So, one thing that I will say, sometimes I've said in debates, and I've never had it answered. Let's say, astronomers are looking at a comet and they see its trajectory is going to collide with the moon on a certain day and time. And at that day and time, you've got space telescopes that are zeroed in on the moon's surface, and it's being televised. And bam, the comet slams into the moon. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, a good scientist would say, that's an extraordinary event. It would seem to require God. I have no plausible naturalistic explanations for it whatsoever. But I also have no tools as a scientist to confirm that God is the cause. So I'm just going to affirm the event itself, and I'm going to leave the cause undetermined. I might believe that God did it, but as a scientist, because I don't have the tools, I'm going to say scientifically, I'm going to leave the cause undetermined. But of course, I'm going to confirm that the event occurred. In the same way, a bad scientist would say, that's an extraordinary event. It would seem to require God. I have no tools to determine it was God. So, and I have no plausible naturalistic explanations. So I'm just going to reject the event outright and say we can't even talk about the event itself. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but we can't say the event itself happened either. Well, of course, that would be insane for a scientist to say that, because you got all the evidence that the comet did slam into the moon. And I think the same thing applies to historians. I think the evidence is there for the historian to conclude Jesus rose from the dead. But to put the theological interpretation on it of resurrection, that might be going a little too far. However, I do think that we could say that it is the best explanation of what happened. If I've got to make that call and go beyond the blunt tools of the historian, what they can actually prove or strongly suggest, I think that the Christian is being more reasonable in interpreting resurrection than a Buddhist saying that it is a rainbow body, or a Hindu saying it's reincarnation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it still requires some faith, but
Sure.
one that is still based on something that's factual and historical as well. Yeah, that's great. We have 3 more questions. We are starting to run out of time, so it'd be good to get through these fairly quickly. I'll go in order, 1, 2, 3. So I think the first one is Valerie. Valerie, you have a question?
Hi, thank you so much. This has been very interesting. My question is, do you know if we have any evidence for, or any like early alternative hypotheses for the resurrection? So like that may have come from like the Romans or the Pharisees, or yeah, or if we have that, and what was like the fallout, if we know what was going on at the time.
Yeah, so we have Matthew, of course, in Matthew 28, where he says, the guards went back to the Jewish leaders and they said, look, we'll get you off the hook with Pilate. Just say that the disciples stole the body while we slept at night. So you have that going on. And Matthew says, and they continue to say this to this very day. So regardless of when you think Matthew was written, when Matthew's writing that, he's saying the Jewish leadership is still saying that the disciples stole the body. Around the year 150 to 155, Justin Martyr writes and says in his dialogue with Trypho, Justin and Trypho were both philosophers. Trypho was a Jewish one, Justin was a Christian one, and Justin says, you yourself know, Trypho, that the Jewish leadership has chosen and ordained certain men to go around and say that the disciples stole the body. So even in the middle of the 2nd century, many Jews were still saying that the disciples had stolen the body. We know that was going on. You've got Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century, and he says that there was a garden and a lettuce patch that the gardener was taking care of in the same place where Jesus was buried. And the gardener was fearful that people coming to see Jesus in his tomb would trample on his lettuce, and so he reburied Jesus. So that's one. And then you've got Celsus in the middle of the 2nd century. He wrote a long treatise against Christians that was answered by Origen in the early 3rd century in something called Contra Celsum. And Celsus wrote, he said that you just couldn't trust it, because who were the ones that were reporting the whole thing about the resurrection to begin with? It was half frantic women. So for him, the the eyewitnesses were unreliable. So there are at least three different naturalistic explanations that non-believers were offering in the first and second centuries against the resurrection. And of course, that the disciples stole the body would be refuted by the fact that we can show that they sincerely believed Jesus rose and appeared to them. The half-frantic women, well, that's in the Gospels. And again, we showed everything from literature, undisputed literature that was written prior to the Gospels. And then in terms of the reburial, I haven't even talked about the burial. My argument isn't even reliant on that. And of course, they could have just gone to a different tomb anyway. And it goes against everything that is even written in the Gospels, which you would have to appeal to anyway as a skeptic about the burial. So that's how I would answer those.
That's great. That's great. Aaron, you have a question, and then we'll finish with Roland.
Question comes from the chat. Dawn submitted this question. She says, "Thank you, Professor Licona. This question relates to the Shroud of Turin and John 20. Do you believe that there is historical evidence for the burial cloths having been kept by the disciples? John 20 specifies details regarding the linen cloths found in the tomb. Recently, the carbon dating relating to the shroud was found to be flawed. Could the Shroud of Turin be the burial cloth of Jesus?"
We'll have to get Jeremiah Johnson next year.
That's a good question, Dawn. I think it's probably authentic, and there's a number of reasons why. In fact, Barry Schwartz was a Jewish agnostic and the official photographer of the Shroud of Turin. He was on the STURP team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. So he was actually there and photographed it. And when David Beck and I served as editors for a Festschrift for Gary Habermas, who is an expert on the shroud, I asked Barry to make a contribution, and his essay in the book, Raised on the Third Day, is, I think, the strongest critique ever on the carbon-14 testing. And again, he was Jewish agnostic. And I said to him when I invited him to write on it, he died a couple of years ago. But I said to him, I said, "Barry, I've heard that you believe the Shroud of Turin is really the authentic burial cloth of Jesus." He says, "I do think that." And Barry, am I right that you think that the image was put on there because of his resurrection? He said, "Well, we can't know for sure, but I'm inclined to think that, it's there because Jesus resurrected from the dead." I said, "Barry, but you're a Jewish agnostic." He said, "That's right." I said, "Why don't you become a Christian? Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, that shows Christianity is probably true." He said, "I know. It's just not important to me. It just doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not really interested in it." I said, "But Barry, if God has revealed to himself to us in Christ," I said, "Look, I'm not trying to debate with you or anything. I appreciate that you're going to write this article, but wouldn't it be in your best interest to become a Christian?" And he just said, "It just doesn't interest me." And I said, "Do you think it should?" And he said, "Well, maybe. But as far as we know, he died and he never put his faith in Christ. But that's where he was with it." So what's really interesting, that we don't know who originally said this, but I've heard several say it. If the Shroud of Turin is authentic, well, then we actually have a photograph of the resurrection. Isn't that pretty cool?
Yeah, there's been a lot of renewed interest in the shroud recently. Jeremiah Johnson's written a very popular book sort of advocating for the shroud. So maybe next year we should invite Jeremiah.
And in the meantime, there's I think it's shroud.com has just massive amount of content on it.
That's great. That's great. Roland, you have the last question, my friend, so make it a good one.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Michael. What I am thinking about is our Lord said in the Gospel of John that unless I go, the Spirit will not come. And also we find in Acts chapter 2 that Peter says that Christ is risen, and the evidence is that what you see today, and quoting the old prophet, I forget his name now, but
Joel.
anyway, it says that this is what was spoken by the prophet. And
Joel chapter 2.
my question really is that can we take as evidence of the resurrection a transformed life of the indwelling spirit, because without which we don't have life in Christ? Romans chapter 8, verse 9, and unless a man has the spirit of Christ, he does not belong to him. And I believe that putting all the gifts of the Spirit aside, I am not emphasizing that, but really the presence of the Spirit, like to love the brethren, the love for the word, that there is you know your life has been transformed. You know it. Nobody can argue with you because you know how you were before and you know how you are now. And I'm wondering, is that evidence of the resurrection, or is that too subjective?
That's a fair question. In my opinion, it's too subjective. Now, it might be good enough for the individual who has experienced the transformed life, okay? So, someone like Paul, or, well, he actually saw the risen Jesus, but someone who has a real transformed life, or they pray, they give up their former life, and all of a sudden they're cured of drug addiction. They just never even turn back to it. That seems like that can, if that kind of stuff happened to me, yeah, I'd be convinced that Christianity is true. I just don't know that I would use it as an apologetic argument. Even the apostles didn't use such a thing to say that, hey, look at our transformed lives, in terms of when they went out and they evangelized. They always used the miracles and resurrection of Jesus. So like in the book of Acts, on several occasions, like Peter at Pentecost, Jesus performed miracles in your midst, and you had him crucified, but he rose from the dead, and we are eyewitnesses of this. And then he talked about how the various sermon summaries in the book of Acts, they would appeal to Psalm 2. You are my son, today I've begotten you, or Psalm 16:10. You will not allow your Holy One to see decay. They would use those scriptures, but they are appealing to the resurrection of Jesus as evidence that Christianity is true. They always appeal to his miracles and resurrection. It wasn't their transformed lives. So I don't know that it would be convincing to a non-believer to say, hey, look, my life was transformed. Now, there could be some instances, and I'm sure there are, when someone says, man, Fred over there, he used to do this, and then he became a Christian. His life has totally changed. He stopped beating his wife. He's not an alcoholic anymore. Wow, what did that? Well, Jesus did that to me, he says. And I'm sure that would attract some people to the gospel. So, but generally speaking, I said I probably wouldn't use it as an evangelism tool, but that's just me.
Thank you.
That's great finishing question there, Roland. Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much, Dr. Licona. I really appreciate your time. If we can all just show our appreciation one last time for Dr. Licona.